Well, hello. My name is Griselda Pollock, and I have the privilege today of speaking with the author, the distinguished author, feminist writer, great cultural theorist, and major figure in European and New York and American culture, Elisabeth Bronfen. Um, Recently, she's published two books, one called Cross Mappings on Visual Culture, a collection of her writings on contemporary artists and historical artists, and basically on artworks, and then her major study of TV serial drama or serial TV drama, which is called Serial Shakespeare, which is part of her long engagement with cinema as a cultural form and with American studies as well. At the same time, as a major figure in literary studies, as well as therefore the studies of historical literature in English as well as in German. This is a contribution to Shakespeare studies, to cinema studies, but also to the whole issue of what Elisabeth and I share, which is cultural analysis. And we share certain questions about not just narratives of the history of certain art forms or the great heroes of them, but what actually cultural forms are doing and how they do it, not just in their own time, but as forms that recur, persist, return, are appropriated, are explored and rewritten in a process where it's not simply a kind of copying or an inheritance or an influence, but a deep conversation which has required a number of different theoretical framings in order to understand. And one of these that Elisabeth talks about is the idea of cross mapping, which we're going to explore. But she's also going to take up in the Serial Shakespeare book issues around appropriation, reconfiguration, persistence, return, translation, which are very major issues in cultural theory. So it's my great pleasure to explore this with Elisabeth. So welcome, Elisabeth Bronfen, who is currently um, not in sunny Leeds in Yorkshire in England, as you see from my background, but she is in her place of work in Zurich, where she teaches at the University of Zurich as the professor of English and American Studies. So I was very struck that we've had a conversation recently, Elisabeth, about cross mappings, and you did a wonderful presentation when we launched this series in which is published, The New Encounters, Arts, Cultures and Concepts with Bloomsbury, in fact, which is now the publisher of this book. But I was so delighted to be able to read Serial Shakespeare. I have always felt since the moment at the beginning of the 21st century that a new cultural form had emerged. That of course we've had long-running soap operas and long-running TV series, and also my generation grew up with with Friends and with Sex and the City, and I borrowed from my daughter a passion for Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But this particular form of serial TV dramas that took off, and many people seem to identify with David Simon's, landmark work, The Wire, seems to be a kind of a form in which some extremely complex issues, great historical ones, political ones, and great extraordinary dramaturgy are being configured in a form that is not just same characters, another story each week, but a very complex form in which each uh, episode in a series and each series itself forms a great kind of arch of drama. So that the one that I watched with great intensity was The West Wing. And I found myself, when I rewatched The West Wing, not Westworld, but West Wing, watching how the arc of each series, particularly Aaron Sorkin being one of the great writers of this kind of form, itself was contained enough to kind of form and invite an analysis in a certain kind of way. But it's not until I read your book, I began to understand that something much more complex is going on in your book. So perhaps you could just say a few words about how you came to write this book, and then we'll go into the particular complexity that you feel you want, that particularly in your introduction, you weave what is going on, because Shakespeare is not unrecognized as, and since one of the great dramatists, one of the great sort of source books for plots, for characters, for words, for sentences. You know, everybody knows a few quotations, even if they don't know they're from Shakespeare. These words say something for us, which keep coming back. And I just found this very interesting. What do you feel you are really doing, intervening in this sense of both how we understand TV serial drama and why Shakespeare is a kind of not a ghostly presence, a very structuring, um, not even a reference point. Please tell me what Shakespeare is doing in TV drama like that.
Okay, I think I mean it's a long genesis that I would have to talk about, because before I worked on Shakespeare and TV drama, I was already working on Shakespeare in Hollywood. And this partially because I am both so interested in Hollywood films, especially Hollywood genre, but also because I've been very influenced by the American philosopher Stanley Cavell, who was one of the first people to talk about a Shakespearean inheritance in this particular form of mass media, and then looks at certain themes and concerns, basically more, and maybe even figural constellations, and to a certain degree the language, looking at kind of the script, the language of the scripts of classic Hollywood, especially the late 30s, early 40s comedies. That's what he was interested in, and then screenwriting in the script of Shakespeare. So I've always been interested in what one could call the cultural afterlife, the as you call this, the persistence, the survival of Shakespeare. Not so much in classic adaptations. This I'm less interested in, nor for that matter in the constant reworkings that Shakespeare has experienced in theater, although all of these things are interlinked, but really in another medium, because that other medium is the stage of the 20th and 21st century. I think this is what we have to understand, that when the kind of popular form, cultural form that Shakespeare was in his time is now probably more likely to be found on screen or on in television than in the theater itself, because of all the cultural value that and high art value that has been imposed on theater. So I was interested in this already, and then I started getting interested in television drama, primarily because most of my students were no longer watching Hollywood films, or in fact art house films. They were watching TV drama. And if I wanted to connect with them, then and find examples that they would immediately understand in order to make a theoretical point, it was television drama. And of course, one has to distinguish between the early moment of that, which is precisely the move from The Sopranos to The Wire, where one could say The Wire is really the founding moment when people realize television drama is something that is to be taken absolutely seriously as a cultural articulation. And then the fact that within the last 15 years, television drama has pretty much eclipsed film, not just in bookstores where you used to be able to buy DVDs for films. 50% of those shelves are now dedicated to television series. The same is true in film magazines, including Sight and Sound, that now spends much more time also describing television shows, and also prizes. People were never interested in the Emmys much, I would say, 15 years ago, and now it is almost more important who gets those prizes than who gets the Oscars or the Globe prizes. So I mean, that was kind of a shift I was interested in. And then given that I always had Shakespeare somewhere or other in the back of my mind for other academic reasons, I did notice that he resurfaces, and he resurfaces in an interesting way. Some texts, some of these shows explicitly cite him, but they always cite him out of context. That is to say, it's a piece of language, as you also said, it's just a citation, or connected with that citation, maybe a type of character, like the melancholic young man who decides to turn his whole world into the stage. In fact, this whole ideal, the world is a stage and we are but players in it. This is an idea you find in a lot of television drama of this more serious kind, because this is television drama which is highly self-reflexive. So it's television drama thinking about the fact that it is serial drama and that it is digital drama. I mean, those are not the same thing. So but the seriality, meaning it builds up on the idea of constant repetitions with changes and a kind of parallelism of the various plot lines, and thinks about that explicitly, and it thinks about itself as a digital medium, and that things are possible in digital medium that are not possible on stage and that are even not possible in analog film. So this self-referentiality is something that you would find in a lot of the more serious of these television dramas. I think one also has to has to hold on to the fact that, of course, at this point, there are so many different shows, and many of those shows are not going to work for the kind of analysis that I'm trying to do here. So once I started looking for it, I did, then you start seeing more and more and more. And the first was, of course, The Wire, where there's one moment where one of the detectives actually quotes Henry IV, "Heavy lies the head that wears the crown," just to talk about one of the drug lords. And that got me interested in thinking about how the whole war on drugs, but also the structure of the drug world in Baltimore as a kind of shadow world of the ordinary Baltimore, that this really is structured along the lines of the kind of royalty in the way we find it in the Shakespearean history plays, because it is all about sovereignty, it's all about legitimacy and legitimation, it's all about power vacuums and people filling power vacuums and what that means. And here again, one has to understand that especially the first Henry, that is to say Henry the Fifth and Henry VI moving into Richard III, it's a set of plays that are also used these days when people do mediation. So these are plays that are used to teach people how to deal with conflict and power struggle. And then the question really becomes, are we in the first act where, that civil war could still be averted, or are we well into the second act where it's really just a question of how power alliances are shifted, how collaborations change, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of connecting these two actually has to do with the kind of survival of the Shakespeare text itself and the way it's moved into different areas, including an area which is really all about a kind of pragmatic discussion of power. And so the interesting thing for me is not just the Shakespeare that is literally quoted by text, but the way that Shakespeare and the way of thinking that Shakespeare proposes to us is something we have, or people who have worked with Shakespeare have in their heads and bring to a text. So there is no direct link between The Wire and Henry VI. But once you're thinking about power relations and you're thinking about royalty and you're thinking about class and class struggle, it becomes so obvious to me that you would want to bring these two together. And in a similar manner, because that's the most radical of the readings I propose in this book, and I worked on shows that I liked, except for the one set of questions which had to do with female queens. It's another question which we'll maybe deal with later. But a show that I was very, very fond of, because I thought it was particularly intelligent, is The Americans, which is a show about this couple who live a double life. They're actually Soviet spies, but they live the life of a perfect American husband and wife running a travel agency in Washington, D.C. Their children go to school. They're totally patriotic, and the whole thing takes place in the 80s. So it's important that we know it's in the early middle 80s, because we know that by 89, the Cold War will be ended and these two spies will be out of a job. I mean, that the type of job they're doing right now will no longer exist. But we know that this was based on the real story of sleepers that were discovered 10, 15 years later. But that's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is if you have Shakespeare in your mind, and when you see these Soviet spies constantly putting on glasses and mustaches and wigs and changing their clothes and assuming different persona of that which is called the American in the 80s, the urban American in the 80s. Of course, I think of cross-dressing, and I immediately come to just Shakespeare comedies, and I ask myself, what is the wager behind cross-dressing? It has to do with identities, the destability of identities, the topsy-turvy world, the violence of assuming constantly new identities, the trickery behind it, the duping, the way that all of this is predicated on forms of conspiracy, because it is, by cross-dressing, you are pointing to the fact that we're all roles and that we can't trust the role that the person is playing for us, nor in fact can we trust our own role. Because if we think of something like Twelfth Night, the Viola character is the one who says, I am I, but maybe I'm not I. I don't really know who I am anymore. So the destabilization of self-identity, the destabilization of, do I know who that person that I am in love with actually is, because they could be someone very different. These moments then become much more vibrant if you think about them in the philosophical terms and also the dramaturgic terms that Shakespeare proposes in those comedies of cross-dressing. So I would say Shakespeare is on one level is a presence having to do with the way we read these shows, because we come out of a certain culture, and this is a culture that is deeply, deeply, deeply informed by Shakespearean thinking, meaning, and I mean our culture, not just Western culture, but most of global culture in one way or another knows more Shakespeare than it knows that it knows. And that brings in a second question. Once I started tracking this, of course, and telling people that I was working on this, everyone was saying, oh, watch this, watch that, watch that. This is very Shakespearean, this is very Shakespearean. So, Succession is very Shakespearean, Billions is very Shakespearean, everything seems to be very Shakespearean. When you ask what does that mean, people aren't quite sure what it means. But I bring in the issue of Billions because this was very funny. So a young scholar told me, you must watch Billions, it's filled with Shakespeare. So I watched and I watched and I watched, and every time something sounded vaguely lofty, I would stop and I would type it into the other computer, and never, ever did I get a Shakespeare hit. This is different from Westworld, where everything that was lofty in Westworld proved to be a Shakespeare, or in one case also Frankenstein quote. And I was like, why did this person tell me to watch this? And then comes this moment where Billions is about a rogue hedge fund investor and a very insane district attorney who tries to indict him. And there's a scene where he's kind of captured someone, and the DA is standing hidden behind, kind of Venetian blind thing, and one person is interrogating the other, and the person who's a kind of a staunch soldier who belongs to our hedge fund, our rogue hedge fund investor, says something that sounds very lofty, and the person interrogating him says, what, is that Shakespeare? And the person responds by saying, no, Stephen King, but true all the same. So it's like the show itself is playing to the fact that everyone is assuming they're hearing Shakespeare when it's lofty and serious and poetic, but it is not. And yet, of course, the scene is Shakespearean. The man with power behind the curtain listening in on two people. This is right out of Measure for Measure, with the Duke posing as the, dressing up as though he were a friar, listening in on people, sending people out to spy on people, bringing back messages to him. So there is that and that is what I would call a spectral presence. But of course, there is also a structuring presence. And this is what I then got interested in, kind of asking myself, okay, if everyone says this is Shakespearean, then we can either mean it's Shakespearean because of certain plots, and I've already mentioned some of them, but we could also think about it as Shakespearean in the sense of Shakespearean dramaturgy. So then I looked at a certain set of plays that kept being referenced by television shows, this being the comedies, especially Midsummer Night's Dream and Lear, and the cross-dressing comedies and the histories, and kind of look at what, if I had to analyze the dramaturgy, now in very concrete terms, not in very complicated narratological terms, what would I come up with? And then there's a set of things that you would come up with, and where you could say, in fact, from the point of screenplay writing, they are taking from Shakespeare something. This is their source text, and they're rewriting it. And one of the things that's most obvious, I think that becomes clear immediately, is the parallel editing. Just to say, in Shakespeare, especially in the histories, Anthony and Cleopatra would be a perfect example for that. They're constantly, there's one subset of stories, there's another subset of stories, there's a third subset of stories. Everything circles around Cleopatra and around Anthony, except that for more than half of the play, these two characters aren't together on stage. So you have this part, and then all the subsidiary parts. This is the parallel logic of television shows, where you may have a major character, as in the Americans, that couple, but then there are other major characters like the FBI people or the people in the Russian embassy, etc., who are maybe not given quite the same importance from the point of view of the story, but they're given a lot of screen time. And this is, in a sense, why one can say that television drama really is the format of the 21st century, because it's no longer one main character or two main characters and everything is subsidiary to it, but rather it's many different narratives that perhaps have as their point of connection a character, but that get a lot more attention than they would in a novel where there really are just subsidiary characters, or even in plays. But the Shakespeare plays do a lot of that, because they constantly have messengers coming in saying something, or people reporting something that they experienced, etc. So this connecting of parallel stories that are running simultaneously and that influence each other would be one of the really important points that one could say travels from Shakespeare to contemporary drama. And again, just to discover that wouldn't be interesting to me. What is interesting to me is, what does that then mean about television drama, and what does this mean for Shakespeare? How can we rethink some of the things that happens in Shakespeare, thinking about it through the lens of what television drama now does with it. And that's why I mentioned the word democratic, because much of these television shows are places where women are working as screenplay writers, where women are working as producers, where women are working as directors, and where they're giving us different stories, connecting them with each other, and thus producing a much more diverse set of figures of identification than we would have had in classic narratives. And that would be the structuring presence of Shakespeare.
Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing so that we actually see more of you, because now we've got the books in real view. Thank you so much for that overview. What I would like to pick up now again is, and I think I've got 2 points I'd like to make, so I'll mention them to you. You can decide in which order you can. One is, you mentioned about democratic, because you do actually talk a lot about the sense that the early modern moment in which Shakespeare is writing his plays is a moment of transformation and uncertainty and conditionality, as these new monarchies are set up from coming out of the sort of the stuff in the history plays, but he's writing within the sort of the 16th century, where the formation of these absolute monarchies and some kind of different way of understanding that is going to happen, and will be followed obviously by Baroque tragic, the Trauerspiel, the sort of different kind of drama, etc. But then you were saying this is also true of us, that these TV serials are profoundly kind of mirroring some aspect of the condition we're in, and also what are some of the issues in the formation of a polity, or the destruction of a polity, or, as you say, these polities within the polity. That when you talk about the Wire showing us kind of a shadow society, setting up as it does throughout, setting up the people trying to run to be the mayor, and the sort of, the town hall and the education and the press. It sort of uses these different kinds of components of the institution of modern societies. But I was very struck by that sense that it's not just Shakespeare as this great authority, it's precisely the kind of not informality, but whatever it is of the Shakespeare plays, they capture a certain kind of moment in the history of early modern Europe, and we are in another different moment. So then the link for that is, you define not citation or quotation or pure translation, although you go through all of those and other scholars have done, but you use this Warburgian term, the Pathos Formula. So you've borrowed something from the work you've been doing in cross mappings and thinking about not only literary texts and cinematic texts, but visual texts, where the pathos formula is a certain kind of image formula. And you've created a TV pathos formula, a TV serial drama. I thought that was so fascinating. So you pick out these different formulae from Romeo and Juliet, or from Midsummer Night's Dream, or as you were saying about cross-dressing being one of those, and see them at play. So perhaps that's two big issues to ask you to think about. But this question of the thenness of Shakespeare and the nowness of this form, but you are undoing that in a certain way. And then the pathos formula is the thing that travels. It has this Nachleben, this afterlife.
Well, maybe to begin with the then and the now, um, what I was always intrigued with in Shakespearean tragedies is that when they finally end, a form of feudal society is changing into something more centralized, turning ultimately into absolute monarchy, historically speaking. But both Elizabeth and even James the First historically are still struggling. She's completely illegitimate. She has to prove her legitimacy constantly. She's no more legitimate than Mary or anyone else. James becomes a little more legitimate. But what I'm interested in is this is a sovereign whose sovereignty is constantly under threat. So this is not yet an absolute monarchy. Rather, it's in her historical time, it's the process of consolidating, as it is also the beginning of the modern police state, the modern surveillance, and of course the beginning of the empire. If you look at those new worlds that are founded at the end of those tragedies, all the way through Cymbeline, for example, they're very unstable. You have the feeling this could repeat again. The whole problem could repeat again. And in fact, Polanski's filming of Macbeth has the surviving son of Banquo going back to the witches. This is even worse in the comedies. By the end of a comedy, by some sheer coincidence or sleight of hand or whatever, you have couples that come together. I mean, the marriage of Hero and Claudius in Much Ado About Nothing is as implausible as it can get. I make a case for Benedict and Beatrice, but most people don't even agree with me there. So here again, then there are these little moments where he'll have Puck in Nick Bottom in no, sorry, it is not Nick Bottom, it is Puck. Robin in Midsummer Night's Dream, clapping his hands and saying the show is over. But again and again, you have the sense that we've come to an end of a story. Something has been resolved, but not really. This could begin again. So this is the seriality that I was already interested in Shakespeare, that then got me interested in the television shows again. And picking and adding to that is the strange, very Shakespearean thing where at the end of many of his plays, a character comes and says, okay, now I'll tell you what just happened. So, we get all of Romeo and Juliet told us again through the friar. Or at the end of Hamlet, Fortinbras asks the one surviving man to say, well, tell me what happened here. And he says, okay, fine, afterwards I'll do that. Or at the end of Winter's Tale, Leontes and Hermione go off stage and they will tell each other everything that happened in that long space of time that they weren't together. And you ask yourself, why do we need that? We have just watched all of this. Why is there this need to recount this and to actually say characters are telling themselves this again? Because the closure isn't complete. So it's the open-endedness and the self-awareness of open-endedness that I was interested in the closures that Shakespeare produces, or put in less positive terms, the destability, the fact that there is no conclusion to the problems that they have resolved dramaturgically. That is to say that something remains open, which means that certain things have not been addressed because they cannot be addressed. Something has been repressed, which may return, etc., etc., etc. And this isn't just interesting now to say, oh, and that's why it can travel, because it's not concluded yet. But it's interesting because for me, it marks these plays as plays sitting on moments of transition. People are waiting for something to happen. People are orienting themselves towards the future. The characters that survive have to figure out, what do I do with the fact that I'm coming from somewhere? The place where I'm coming from is not quite the same as the place that I am in right now. I'm moving towards something, but I don't quite know what that is. And this notion of transition is something that I think we are posed with again. We're confronted with again at the beginning of the 21st century, because you could say that we are closer to the early modern period now than the 1990s were. You could say that around 2000, the long modernity, if you want to call it that, was ended. A modernity that begins in 1610-ish. Because of the destabilization, because of globalization, which has to do with decentralization, because of the way different power structures have built themselves, and they're kind of competing with each other and they're circling around each other. But even the notion of empires has changed. So we're in a moment of transition again. I'm not saying that we're going back to the feudalism of the pre-modern, but it is a moment of transition. And I think that in the last few years, the nervousness everyone has felt. In fact, the reason why people keep quoting Gramsci with his interregnum, saying that the interregnum, something has died, something new is coming, we don't know what it is, we don't know what it is, and this produces monsters, whether it's the alt-right, right-wing populism, whether it's other left-wing mass movements, whether it's uncertainty about globalization, COVID-19 making this even more obvious, but we've been feeling uncertain, destabilized, uncomfortable, without knowing, but what should we do? You know, what would the best narrative be for today? What are the best forms of representation? In fact, even on the level of theory, what theories would make most sense to describe this moment? This uncertainty, which we didn't in that sense have, let's say, in the 80s or 90s. So it's the interim that I'm interested in. And the fact, if one thinks about Shakespeare plays as plays that think about themselves writing in the interim, we're looking for something towards something. We are moving somewhere. We know with certainty that what we're coming from is not there anymore, but we don't know where we're going. What do we do with that? This open-endedness as a way of thinking this through. That's the kind of connection that on a large political and philosophical level, I want to draw between Shakespeare and what television drama is doing. And in that sense, I think what television drama is doing with Shakespeare is different from what classic Hollywood was doing with Shakespeare, from the kind of things that Cavell was tracking. But that has to do with what is the point of this? You know, what are the messages we're getting? What are the themes and concerns that they're raising? What kind of questions do they ask us to ask of the shows and of Shakespeare? But what the formal aspect that you mentioned with the Pathos Formula, I think that touches on the fact that we are once again thinking about forms. I mean, this is curious. One wouldn't have thought that a formalist discussion would come back, because this was, you know, very 1920s with the Slavic thinkers, and then, you know, to a certain degree in the 50s again. But the formalism that I'm interested in, and why I think Warburg is such an important thinker for this kind of work, is to understand that forms are the material basis for cultural heritage, for inheritance, for remembrance, and for haunting. That it's not on the thematic level that these things come back to us and touch us again, affect us again, but that it's because they are formalized that they can do that. And that's why I insist so much that when we think of Pathos formulas with Warburg, or if we bring this in connection with what Greenblatt calls intensities, it's not the intensities per se, but it's the way they have been formalized, or rather the fact that they have been formalized and the way they've been formalized. This is what makes this persistence possible, and also what makes it necessary. So to look at what are those forms, because these forms aren't just forms, they're forms that contain something. And that's where the concept of containment is so interesting to me, because the concept of containment has two meanings, right? It delimitates something, it kind of draws boundaries about something, but it also preserves something. And that's what I'm so interested in the notion of the formula, that it's able to take something and put it into like a container, preserving it, but also containing some of it. Because ultimately, of course, I'm coming at this from psychoanalysis with the notion of trauma, and the way that trauma can only be conceptualized and can only be represented in a contained, in a truncated, in a shaped form. So the Shakespeare himself has a word for this, and he calls it shapes. And I think it would be, you know, shapes and shaping, those shaping fantasies. Yeah, it's not just the fantasies, but the shapes that give form to fantasies. He's very clear about that. And I think that's what is so interesting about Warburg also, that he asks us to look at formal language. And then, of course, Warburg himself was interested in static images, because he was interested in paintings and photographs and sketches, graphics. But if you understand the idea behind Warburg, I don't see why one couldn't say, okay, but I am now going to use this to talk about narrative formula, to talk about linguistic formula, you know, the world's but a stage. I mean, that too is a pathos formula. Or one of the things that I was very interested in this book is the notion of female sovereignty as a problem. Not female sovereignty as female sovereignty, but female sovereignty as a formula, women in power, women in ultimate power, producing the combination of fascination and deep anxiety. That too is a formula, and it's a formula which you can find in literature, but which you can also find in these television dramas, because once I started looking for them, it's not just Claire Underwood and House of Cards, but in fact there are some 12 television shows that think through what would happen if a woman would end up in the Oval Office. Obviously always in relationship to Clinton, so that one can talk about the kind of Hillary effect, either as she's going to do the first time or she's going to do the second time, and all the hopes, but also the anxiety that raises. And yet, in, you know, thinking through this through in relationship to the queens in Shakespeare, you see that they too are figures of this ambivalence. People, they're fascinating, but they're also monstrous.
Let's take that one up, because I think that's it's a little overlap. I remember when you first told me about the serial Shakespeare, I was really fascinated, because on the verge of the first election, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, I ran a kind of study session, a kind of think center. Kath organized something called America Elects. And one of the things that I did for that, very briefly, and not at the depth at all in terms of the analysis that I found in your book, and which was wonderful, but I just asked, how had television prepared people for the possibility of a Black president or a woman president? And I found exactly what you're saying, in the sense that there were instances where the presence of somebody, an African-American actor, being a president in a whole range of things was there, from, you know, Morton Freeman playing somebody to, you know, all sorts of different kind of major characters, and even in certain of the sort of, you know, comedic science fiction films. But it was there was a certain kind of presence which made it not an absence at all. But at the same time, that point, as far as I know, it was only Commander-in-Chief had gone there. And then subsequently, since then, and you track that through Veep, but you also track it through the last two or three series of Homeland, which obviously, as you say, catches up on the second round, the sort of the 4 years later. And I was really interested in this question of, because it goes back as an art historian. Also, people for a long time argued about the exploration of monarchic power, the king's body, the sovereign body, and the woman's body. And Stephen Greenblatt, as we both know from wonderful writing about the Shakespearean period and the idea of self-fashioning, talks about, you know, how the, as it were, the monarch formulate, you know, these new absolute monarchs, Francis I and Henry VIII, and subsequently fashion themselves on a certain idea of masculinity, of the the king, the ruler, the soldier, the father, etc. But that self-fashioning in that period says, is, that is modeling it around, that for women is the virgin. It's not a monarchical body. And so people study, and I know you've written about divas and celebrity, and you did a wonderful lecture for us at Leeds once with your colleague about the Queen Elizabeth as one of these problematic bodies, to find a formula for this, a visual formula for rulership and sovereignty and femininity. But now you've really taken that and brought that kind of Shakespearean age question into these real histories of the struggle for the United States that had stuttered. It was given a chance, and it's sort of stumbled at the point of the 2016 election, no, when the first of Barack Obama, and then stumbled again 2008, 2007, 8, that's right, so November 2007, and then stumbled again, and we find ourselves in a very different, and then slipping in under the post-Trump rubric is, a woman of wonderful range of a woman vice president of a wonderful range of backgrounds and histories and cultures, who figures as the first Black woman. And we've suddenly got those two together in this moment. So perhaps could you just talk about this thing about why do you think that the TV drama can only, the pathos formula for women in rulership is this combination of fascination and cruelty, or fascination and monstrosity. It's not just heavy duty sexism, it's something much, much deeper. So by calling it a pathos formula that has this, what you say, this shaping of something that we find in Shakespeare as well as now, what's your exploration of that? Can you talk a bit about that?
I mean, first of all, I think if we talk about self-fashioning in relationship to Queen Elizabeth, and that's important for the template of the Shakespeare plays that I then looked at, is she's the virgin queen who can't marry because she's married to England and does not want to be dominated by a man in a culture where that would have been the case if she'd married, which is why in Twelfth Night the woman resists for such a long time to marry. But she's also the maternal figure. She's not just married to England, the wife of England. So she's the virgin, she's the wife of the nation, and she's the mother of her subjects. But she's also the monster. I mean, for everyone who's not Anglican, she is the epitome of monstrous, for all the Catholics and for the Irish, etc. So already in her case, and she's illegitimate. And I think the question of legitimacy is an absolutely central one here. She is illegitimate. In fact, any woman in a position of power in our culture, this is not true, curiously enough, in India, and it's not true in
or Sri Lanka. I mean,
it's not true in Southeast Asia,
or Philippines, or
all that whole area. It's not true. It's not true in China. If you think of Madame Mao, I'm a little hesitant about South America, but anyway, so I think it has to do, the root of all of this has to do Judeo-Christian culture, and especially Christian culture. Okay, so let me just say that. So this is what I was tracking in Shakespeare. If you do a whole typology from the most sane queen, this would be the Princess of France, who becomes the Queen of France at the end of Love's Labour's Lost, to the worst examples in Cymbeline or no, that's not a good one, but Titus Andronicus. There you have this connection. Their mothers fighting for the wrong sons, their wives killing off their husbands or supporting them stupidly. They are monstrous. They're usually beautiful. They're powerful, all of that. And they're always illegitimate. They're not, they have no legitimacy because they are women. And I think this is the thing we have to hold on to. Though when we then translate to the American system, we have to understand that on the one hand, and Novak has spoken about that when he calls it choosing our president. It's like choosing a king. The presidents are royalty in the American cultural imaginary, but they are royalty for a certain period of time. They can be there for 4 or 8 years and then they aren't there anymore, although their sons might come. So you can have the question of succession, but this is not aristocracy in the British sense. They're there for life. This is important. Nevertheless, the question of legitimacy is the one that I want to pick up on. And there's so many issues here. First of all, it is absolutely true that until Hillary Clinton ran for presidency, we had no films with a woman in the Oval Office, except for the really famous one, Kisses from My President, where her husband can't deal with the fact that he's the Mr. What would it be called? First husband, and
First husband. No, he's the first lord.
holds her into bed all the time so that she gets pregnant, and then she has to abdicate. So abdication as one logical conclusion. The second conclusion is that they get there by murder, and they murder until they're there all alone. And the third one is that they are legitimate, but they've gotten involved in some illegalities because of dirty hands politics, which then also poses the question of, in all cases, they're never, these presidents, these female presidents that we see in television drama are never legitimate either. And as I say, the template was this film where she abdicates because of her pregnancy, and commander-in-chief, where, and this is the other thing that's important, especially with Kamala Harris now, when I checked this, I did this kind of positivistic diagram. How many of them are Republicans? How many of them are Democrats? It's 50-50, although many of them are independents. Then I looked at how many of them are voted in. Less than half. Most of them become president because they were Secretary of State and then vice president, and then something happens to the president. Either they are killed by this woman or they happen to die. But anyway, in more than 50% of these female presidents in these television shows have not been elected, so they have to be re-elected. And then Commander-in-Chief, of course, stops before that can even happen. If they are elected, almost all of them have to resign because they've gotten involved in some form of corruption. So that's why I say the thing that travels from Shakespeare now is this question of the legitimacy. So when Kamala Harris was chosen by Biden, everyone was like, oh yeah, sure, she's then going to become president, because that's what happens in television shows. So this is precisely this priming effect that films or television prepare us for. And indeed, it was completely correct that in 2007, we had to say we were not prepared for Hillary Clinton. Television had not prepared us, the movies had not prepared us, the media had not prepared us for her. I mean, there are other reasons why Obama was privileged over her. This had to do with the internal politics inside the Democratic Party, but it made perfect sense afterwards, because we realized culturally we're not there yet. The only places where we've seen them are in science fiction films, where it's so exaggerated, but there is this priming effect as well. We do this in science fiction so that then when this becomes reality, we've kind of already seen that. This didn't work for, I mean, there are many reasons why it didn't work for Hillary Clinton, but I would emphasize it does also have to do with the stories that have already been told us and the Pathos Formula. We've just never seen women before 2007. We never saw, except for this one movie, a woman in the White House, in the Oval Office, sitting behind that desk. Since then, we've seen it a lot, but in all cases, she's not secure, even in the most benign, which is Madam Secretary, where for 7 seasons we watched this woman being supported by the lovely older president, and she's smart. Mind you, she's from the intelligence community, but okay, that's another thing. She's smart and she's able to resolve all conflicts. This is a repeat of Commander-in-Chief, actually. That was the other thing I was interested in. The kind of second wave television shows pick up on the first wave and basically tell the same stories with a difference, but here the husband is really nice and the children are, even she has an opponent, in obviously a Republican, in this case he's a representative who tries to get her get an impeachment going. So there's a fascination with that. And now comes my point. Commander-in-Chief, it was an okay show, but to a certain degree we can understand why they didn't renew that. It's dramaturgically not interesting. I think the idea of a ruler who has to of a female ruler who has to constantly fight crises and where she constantly has to prove herself, is dramaturgically more interesting than, and this is the difference with West Wing. In West Wing, you could have a kind of quasi-like God, um, president, divine president, who is introduced in the show in the very first episode. He's had this accident and he's late to a meeting, and someone is quoting a passage, and he is the only one who can actually speak in the biblical sense, and he's speaking as God, and thus he walks in, and then he is like the voice of God. He's never, his legitimacy is never questioned, and that's the deep gender difference that that one has to say we're still stuck with, which we find in Shakespeare. Look at those history plays. None of those queens are legitimate. The poor Henry VI, he was bamboozled by that horrible woman, that foreigner, that French queen, Queen Margaret. Anyway, so this is where you can see these shows engaging with a cultural anxiety that is still there, that in this case is particularly American, not as European, but also not entirely foreign in Europe, because even Merkel, even May, even Marine Le Pen have a very different status than their male counterparts. And it's turning this into interesting stories, because the man behind the Oval Office, the man in the Oval Office, the man behind the desk, he's just a ruler. We have an endless amount of images for the ruler. He can be corrupt, he can be wise, he can be young, this would be Obama, et cetera, or he can be this bizarre thing that Trump was, which is a kind of clown, a kind of pantomime, a kind of player of emotions, kind of a director thing. But they are there. And a woman behind that desk has to constantly prove that she should be sitting behind that desk. And that, I think, continues to reflect the cultural moment. And I think this is why there are so many shows, because these shows are working around this problem. And as I say, there are various options. They have competent but compromised, competent but still destabilized, competent and monstrous, vicious, competent and to be erased immediately after 2 episodes. And that's the interesting thing that one can track here. And with Kamala Harris, they are responding to television. I mean, that's what and they are clearly responding to television. This is a completely scripted, I mean, the whole Biden campaign was so television scripted insofar as it was a repetition of a repetition of a repetition. Even Kamala Harris, when Kamala Harris said, oh, and Biden, he had the audacity to name me as his vice president, immigrant daughter, blah, blah. She was invoking Geraldine Ferraro. Everyone has forgotten this. The Italian American was diverse in the 70s, right? Yeah. I mean, now we don't see it that way anymore, but she was the daughter of immigrants. So even this is picking up on a previous, though very, very ill-fated, one must say, because poor Walter Mondale lost everything but DC during that vote. But picking up on something, but they're also picking up on the television shows that were picking up on this. So we're kind of in a recycling loop, and they're doing it completely open-handed. Everyone should be able to see that, probably does see it, and that's why it works. And that's where I think we can say again, this is the whole idea with the Pathos Formula. They have now discovered, we've seen this in various television shows, let's distill what worked there and let's rework that. So we are always seeing Kamala Harris in a certain type of clothes, with certain type of shoes. Sometimes they're sneakers, sometimes they're high heels, sometimes it's just a sweater, sometimes it's a beautiful jacket, the necklaces, the way she speaks, the fact that Biden really choreographs her. Whichever photographs, I mean, we could do an analysis of the photographs in which he's alone, sometimes with lots of security men, and he's walking in front of or towards some kind of sunset or sunrise, but most often she's standing slightly distanced from him, and that's where social distancing visually works very well. It's perfect. She is literally at his side at a distance, but she's always there, and she's always perfectly placed so that we look at the image and we see them both. It's not like she's behind him and shorter. She's normally on the same, because of the heels, she's normally on the same height, or they staged in such a way that she is really eye to eye. And this is an attempt, I think, this is a priming thing. Visually, that campaign and now this presidency is priming us for something. And that's what they've learned from television.
So that completely brings around the circle in terms of the questions of these are often explorations of the polity, the whole question of what kind of society we live in and stuff, and obviously looking at rulers is a kind of intriguing sense of this, of things, etc. So I love this idea then the pathos formula becomes something that that the sort of the legacy of Shakespearean drama, provides some the for. They are obviously known to anybody who's a script writer. They will have all studied English literature at some point, and Shakespeare would have been there in terms of the English language writings, etc. And then, of course, as you say, that this can travel, but you're also suggesting then there's the moment where TV drama not only has these effects, primes us in anticipation, primes our imaginations, but from a kind of feminist point of view, this is a very critical thing, which is how would we begin to encourage people to write pathos or to
Right.
find the pathos point or to invent them that are appropriate to changing this sense that in a sense our whole democracy can only be represented with some kind of male figure at the head, and that the feminine figure
Mhm.
is either the sort of the cold virgin or the mother or the wife or there's something wrong, and that this is a site of, I think what's brilliant what you're saying, illegitimacy, because I don't think anybody's ever made so clear to me in the sense that patriarchy delegitimizes women as it's not just exclude or repress or discriminate against. There's something in the kind of patriarchal imaginary which makes that too difficult when you try to put the pathos formula, as I say, of woman and power together. And obviously going back to Joan Riviere and the sort of the analysis of the sort of psychic agony of the women of the 1920s who weren't politically in power but were imagining themselves taking up the power of speech within their psychological organizations. So I always imagine
Mhm.
both Anna Freud and Joan Riviere. I don't imagine that Melanie Klein worried too much, who was, a different kind of figure, but, she's talking very much in that essay, Woman as Masquerade, about her own experience. And I think all of us who've become women academics, we've understood this kind of sense that we're entering into a realm which does not have the pathos formula, that there was the sort of a certain image of the woman intellectual inherited from the 19th century, in one sense. And now we're trying to reformulate that around speech. But I think in the question of power, so we have some of that in terms of, I think, and I would just like to, I think we should finish this in a moment. Obviously, we've all had an event this weekend with the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip. And I feel that the Crown has primed people for
Mhm.
both how to see him and how they speak of him now. It's very interesting. And also has primed people in the way that they accepted the sort of Meghan and Harry interview. Now, I don't want to go too far into those things because I think they're immensely complicated, etc. But I felt, interestingly, that when they, even Harry and Meghan, when they talked about the roles they might have had, they said, we could have, we had this great tour in Australia. We could have been, we did sort of Charles and Diana too, but they wouldn't have said that without the Crown. And the Crown is obviously, I always think that Peter Morgan, I call Peter Morgan in a sense, the contemporary Shakespearean writer, not because obviously he writes prose, because contemporary script writing is a completely not theatrical speechifying, but very economical. It's a very, very precise form, wonderful. But in the sense of, he's written about Clinton, he's written about Tony Blair, he wrote about the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Clinton, Blair, Bush, and then about this famous uh, football manager in England. All his main plays are about this. And then the Queen, it's very interesting that he's actually in precisely the area that you've been exploring around the questions of sovereignty and power and the crown, where the crown should go to amongst the wire, etc. So it seems to me that your book has given us an insight into how we should appreciate this drama series, how we might read it. We're reading, as you say, not for the Shakespearean quotes, but we read with Shakespeare, or we find the conversation there, etc. But I just wonder if you wanted to say anything about the sort of what happens now in terms of
Well, let me make a very quick comment on Meghan, Harry, and Oprah. Oprah, who is, of course, if we're thinking of how to reshape the conscience of the world, or work on the cultural imaginary, that's the way I would formulate it. Oprah Winfrey has been doing a lot of work, because she's this African-American woman who is not thin. She takes up a lot of space when she sits wherever she sits, and she has gotten Americans to read certain things in certain ways for the last 20 or so years. So when she does this interview with Meghan and Harry, I would say she knows exactly what she's doing. And I really felt, as I was watching this, because of course everyone was thinking about this interview in relationship to the crown, and they were interested in this in relationship to the most scintillating character in the television show, namely Margaret, with also the very scintillating actresses that played Margaret in the three parts. I mean, the new set is going to have another actress. But I, of course, couldn't help thinking about Marx and Hegel, and the fact that Hegel says in history, important characters always repeat themselves. And Marx corrects him and says, yes, first time is tragedy, second time is farce. I mean, is there more to say? We have Princess Diana, who in her own way was somewhat of a tragic character. And now Meghan comes along and she's the farcical repetition of Diana. Were they aware of this? Probably not. But I think if you see this through the lens of television drama, it becomes very clear this is a completely scripted situation, picking up not just on the Diana story, which they did so explicitly, but picking up on the television show that shows Diana in Australia, wonderfully charismatic, and then the husband who is jealous of her. So it's the recycling and the self-awareness of the recycling that I would say that is important. But the second thing, and the more serious part now, is indeed a reason why I think it's worth returning to what feminists were doing in the 70s and 80s, this whole idea that art is also a form of criticism, and that it is on the level of the stories we tell and the way we talk about the stories that we tell, that we can change the perception of the world and the consciousness of the world. And I don't just mean colorblind casting. I think it requires more than that. It's not enough just to put a woman into the role of Macbeth or King Lear or whatever. It means rethinking the premises of why, and that's where I would completely underline what you said with patriarchy, why patriarchy is predicated on a delegitimation of women. So it means rethinking what the mother in her alliance to her children as opposed to her alliance to her work should look like. It means rethinking what sexual allure looks like if we want to take it away from the Mary Eve the distinction. It means rethinking the combination of the natural body and the symbolic body, which is so important for positions of power. And because the things that you addressed with Joan Fontaine, and I mean, I remember our colleagues and us really thinking about how are we going to dress. No longer the stewardess, flight attendant type of suits, but garish, headdress and jewelry and whatever, because we were thinking about what impressions do we make exactly. But we realized, I think maybe 10 years ago, that in itself was not enough. That it meant even rethinking, what does the masquerade we put on, because everyone is putting on a masquerade, what does that mean? So I think that's where the real work is, and I think, and the work requires a very serious analysis of how, what these positions are that we are trying to refigure, reformulate, rewrite. And that was an interest in the 70s, 80s feminist criticism and feminist praxis. But it clearly didn't go far enough because it didn't have the complete impact that we had hoped it would have. So it kind of means revisiting this, and revisiting not just what was successful or what was creative and vital at the time, but also revisiting why it didn't work.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant point, which is where I think your book makes an incredible contribution, and this conversation uh, itself is a contribution to this. So I can only thank you for spending the time to talk us through this. And I hope this is an opportunity for people to read the book, but also in a sense to engage precisely with the incredible import of the kind of analysis that you're doing. So I want to thank you enormously for that. And I have to thank.
And I want to thank you, Griselda, for making this conversation possible.
Well, I think I want to carry on this kind of,
Yes.
work of conversation. I think it's important because we are these scholars who may now have all our great work locked in quite massive books, and we want people to kind of see these books are engaging with the worlds they're living in, the real worlds that they're living in, the real political. And I think you are one of the most remarkable thinkers for bringing this forward to us in a way that is so compelling. So excellent. So thank you so much. So I'm going to thank you.